The bell rang loudly through the hallways, signaling the end of the exam period. In Mr. Reynolds' classroom, students hurried to place their test papers on his desk, their faces filled with a mix of relief and anxiety. Some were confident, others unsure, but one student stood out among the rest: Jamal. Jamal approached the teacher's desk with quiet confidence, placing his paper neatly on top of the pile. He was one of the top-performing students in the entire school, and he knew he had done well. Mr. Reynolds, however, barely looked at him. He sat back in his chair, his cold blue eyes filled with the same dismissive arrogance Jamal had grown used to. He had seen this game play out before. No matter how hard Jamal worked, no matter how flawless his answers were, Mr. Reynolds always found a reason to mark him down. The teacher smirked, tapping his fingers against his desk. "Let's hope you didn't overestimate yourself, Jamal," he said smoothly, his voice laced with condescension. Jamal didn't react. He never did. He had learned a long time ago that reacting only gave people like Mr. Reynolds what they wanted. Instead, he gave a small nod, turned on his heel, and walked out of the room. As the last student exited, Mr. Reynolds exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Thinks he's smarter than he is," he muttered under his breath, reaching for Jamal's test. He flipped through the pages lazily at first, but then his smirk disappeared. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the answers. Every question was correct. The essays were written with flawless precision, the calculations exact. His grip on the paper tightened. Jamal had aced the exam, and that was a problem. The next day, the school hallways buzzed with nervous chatter as students gathered around the grade sheets pinned outside Mr. Reynolds' classroom. The final exam scores had been posted, and eager eyes scanned the lists, some cheering in relief, others sighing in disappointment. Jamal walked up to the board, his heart steady but expectant. He had studied hard, poured everything into his work. There was no way he hadn't scored high, but as his eyes found his name, his stomach dropped. Jamal Carter. D. His breath caught in his throat. A D. That had to be a mistake. It had to be. Behind him, a hush fell over the crowd. Students exchanged uncertain glances, some leaning in to double-check. They knew Jamal. He was the smartest student in the class, if not the entire school. "No way, man," someone whispered. "He's the only one who actually understood that test," another muttered. Jamal felt a wave of humiliation and frustration roll through him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He could already feel the stares, the whispers growing louder as people noticed his reaction. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. With a deep breath, he turned away from the board and marched straight into Mr. Reynolds' classroom. The teacher sat at his desk, leisurely sipping from a steaming mug of coffee, completely unbothered as if he hadn't just ruined a student's future. He didn't even look up when Jamal entered. "Sir," Jamal said, his voice measured but firm, "there must be a mistake. I checked my answers. I deserve an A." Mr. Reynolds finally looked up, and the mocking smile that curled onto his lips sent a shiver of anger through Jamal's chest. He set his mug down with a soft clink, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, Jamal," he sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. "You people always think you deserve more than you earn." Jamal's jaw tightened. A cold silence settled between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jamal's fists clenched at his sides, but he willed himself to stay calm. He had learned the hard way that arguing with men like Mr. Reynolds only made things worse. Taking a slow breath, he pressed on. "Sir, with all due respect, I know I passed that test. My work was accurate. I'd like to see my exam." Mr. Reynolds chuckled, shaking his head, clearly enjoying this. "You think you're special, don't you?" he said, standing up and looming over Jamal. "You think colleges are just going to throw scholarships at you because you can put a few words together on a test?" He walked around his desk, placing a heavy hand on Jamal's shoulder, a touch that felt more like a warning than reassurance. Let me tell you something, son, he continued, his voice dipping lower, meant only for Jamal to hear. The world doesn't cater to kids like you. You could be the smartest one in this whole damn school, and it wouldn't matter. Because at the end of the day, I decide what you're worth. Jamal felt his blood boil, but still, he didn't react. Not the way Mr. Reynolds wanted him to. Instead, he smiled. A small, knowing smile. It was the kind of smile that said, I see you, I know exactly what you're doing, and you will regret this. Mr. Reynolds's smirk faltered, just for a second. Jamal took a step back, adjusting his backpack, still calm, still in control. Good luck getting into any real college with that grade, Mr. Reynolds added smugly, taking a sip of his coffee, utterly convinced he had won. But what he didn't know, what he could never predict, was that Jamal Carter wasn't just going to college, he was going to the White House. Jamal walked out of Mr. Reynolds' classroom with his fists clenched so tightly that his nails nearly dug into his palms. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. This wasn't over. He stormed down the hall, past the rows of lockers and the groups of students still whispering about his grade. He wasn't going to just accept this. Not this time. Minutes later, he stood before the principal's office, knocking sharply before stepping inside. Principal Harris, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a reputation for playing it safe, looked up from his desk, adjusting his glasses. Mr. Carter, he said, surprised to see him. What can I do for you? Jamal stood tall, refusing to let his frustration cloud his words. Sir, I need to report an unfair grade. I believe Mr. Reynolds deliberately failed me on my final exam. Principal Harris sighed, already looking uneasy. That's a serious accusation, Jamal. I have proof, Jamal insisted. If I can just see my test. Before he could finish, the door swung open behind him. Mr. Reynolds strolled in casually, hands in his pockets, looking as relaxed as ever. I was wondering when you'd try to pull something like this, he said, shaking his head with mock disappointment. Jamal clenched his jaw, but he didn't back down. The principal frowned. Mr. Reynolds, Jamal believes his grade was unfair. Mr. Reynolds let out a low chuckle, crossing his arms. Principal Harris, I've been teaching for 20 years. I grade fairly. If Jamal got a D, it's because that's what he earned. Jamal felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. Then let me see my test. Mr. Reynolds shrugged, feigning innocence. I'm afraid that's against school policy. Once grades are finalized, there's no review process. Jamal's stomach tightened. The principal gave a small sigh, rubbing his temple. Jamal, I understand your frustration, but unless there's solid evidence, I have to stand by my teacher's judgment. Jamal's heart sank. This was the system. Rigged, unfair, designed to protect people like Mr. Reynolds and keep students like him in check. He wanted to fight, to demand justice, but he knew it wouldn't work. Not this way. So he did something that Mr. Reynolds didn't expect. He smiled. A quiet, calm smile. That's fine, he said, voice steady. I don't need your approval. Mr. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. Excuse me? Jamal turned on his heel and walked out of the office without another word. Because if the system wasn't going to recognize his worth, then he was going to prove it somewhere else. That night, Jamal sat at his desk, the glow of his laptop illuminating his determined face. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he stared at the submission page for the National Essay Competition on Social Justice. It was a prestigious contest, with thousands of applicants from across the country. The winners received scholarships, national recognition, and, most importantly, a chance to meet the president at the White House. Jamal exhaled slowly, then placed his hands on the keys. And he began to write. He wrote about his struggles, about the barriers he faced, about the feeling of having his success stolen just because of the color of his skin. He poured everything he had into that essay. His anger, his resilience, his hope, all of it spilled onto the page. When he was finished, he read it over twice. It was perfect. With one final deep breath, he hit submit. And then, he waited, months later. Jamal had almost forgotten about the essay. Between school, college applications, and brushing off Mr. Reynolds's smug glances, life had moved on. Until one day, a letter arrived. A thick, official White House envelope, with his name printed on the front. His heart pounded as he tore it open, his hands slightly shaking. His eyes scanned the first line. Dear Mr. Carter, congratulations. We are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as the winner of this year's National Essay Competition on Social Justice. Jamal's breath hitched. He read the next line. As part of your award, you are invited to the White House for a special ceremony, where you will meet the President of the United States. For a long moment, he just stared at the letter. Then, he grinned, because Mr. Reynolds had tried to bury him. But now, he was about to stand in the White House. The news spread like wildfire. By the next morning, Jamal Carter's name was everywhere. The school's website had his picture on the front page with a bold headline, Our very own Jamal Carter wins National Essay Competition, invited to the White House. Local newspapers picked up the story, and soon, social media was buzzing with posts about the brilliant student who defied all odds. Students whispered in the hallways, sharing the news like it was the most exciting thing to ever happen at the school. Teachers exchanged looks of pride and admiration, some shaking their heads in disbelief. But no one looked more stunned than Mr. Reynolds. He sat at his desk, staring blankly at the computer screen where Jamal's face smiled back at him from the school's website. His fingers trembled around his coffee mug, the liquid inside now cold and untouched. This couldn't be real. A knock on the door snapped him out of his daze. Principal Harris stepped inside, grinning from ear to ear. Mr. Reynolds, he said, brimming with excitement, we're holding a surprise assembly for Jamal today. The whole school is going to celebrate this incredible achievement. You should be there. You're his teacher, after all. The words burned. Mr. Reynolds swallowed hard, nodding stiffly. Of course, he said, forcing a smile. The school auditorium was packed. Students filled the seats, murmuring with excitement as the lights dimmed and the principal took the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, today we celebrate something extraordinary. His voice boomed through the speakers, echoing off the walls. The crowd quieted, eager to hear what was coming next. We are here to honor one of our own, a student who has not only excelled academically, but has also inspired us all with his determination and brilliance. Jamal sat near the front, unsuspecting, until his name was called. Please give a standing ovation to the winner of the National Essay Competition, Jamal Carter. The auditorium exploded with cheers and applause. Students rose to their feet, clapping, whistling, some even chanting his name. Jamal's eyes widened in shock, but as he stood, a slow smile spread across his face. He made his way toward the stage, shaking hands with the principal, feeling the weight of the moment. But there was one more twist waiting for him. As Jamal took center stage, the principal turned to the side with a bright smile. And of course, let's not forget the teacher who helped shape his journey. Mr. Reynolds, please join us on stage. A visible hush fell over the crowd. Jamal's smile didn't waver, but a knowing glint flickered in his eyes as he turned his head slightly. The entire room shifted their gaze toward Mr. Reynolds. The teacher sat in the front row, his face completely drained of color. He looked like a man being led to his own execution. For a split second, he hesitated. But with cameras flashing and eyes locked onto him, he had no choice. Slowly, he rose to his feet, forcing his legs to move. He climbed the stairs onto the stage, his stiff, plastic smile barely holding together. He stopped beside Jamal, standing rigid, the weight of the moment crushing him. But then, the final announcement dropped. And now, for the most exciting part. Principal Harris beamed. In recognition of his remarkable achievement, Jamal Carter will be flying out next week to meet the President of the United States at the White House. The auditorium erupted. Screams, cheers, a thunderous roar of applause filled the space. Students jumped up from their seats, some pulling out their phones to record. And right there, frozen on stage, stood Mr. Reynolds. His smile vanished instantly, his body stiff, his breathing shallow. Jamal was going to meet the president, not just any college, not just an honor roll mention, the president. This wasn't just success, it was a level of victory he never thought Jamal would reach. A journalist from the local newspaper rushed toward the stage, microphone in hand. "Jamal," she said, beaming, "everyone is dying to know, what inspired you to write this essay?" The room quieted slightly, waiting for his answer. Jamal took a slow breath, then turned his gaze directly toward Mr. Reynolds, his expression calm, his voice steady. "Some people tried to hold me back," he said simply. Then, with a knowing smirk, he added, "But no one can stop what's meant to be." The crowd roared again, cameras flashed wildly. Mr. Reynolds stood there, silent, drowning in the weight of his own actions, because in that moment, he knew. Jamal had won, and he would never be able to take it away from him again. The fallout was swift and brutal. A few days after the assembly, an investigative journalist picked up Jamal's story, digging deeper into Mr. Reynolds' history. What started as a simple feature on Jamal's White House invitation quickly turned into an exposé on discrimination within the school. Past students came forward. Black students. Students who had faced the same unfair treatment, the same rigged grading, and the same dismissive attitude from Mr. Reynolds. Some had given up. Others had transferred. But they all shared one thing in common. They had been robbed of opportunities. The pressure mounted fast. The school district launched an investigation, and what they found was undeniable. Jamal's final exam had been tampered with. His answers, originally flawless, had been incorrectly marked down. The evidence was damning. The news shook the entire school. The principal, once eager to defend his teacher, was now scrambling to save face. With media attention growing, he had no choice but to publicly announce a full review of Jamal's academic records. The results? Jamal had been cheated out of multiple A's throughout the year, and it wasn't just Jamal. One by one, other students' grades were checked, and a pattern emerged. Mr. Reynolds had been systematically lowering the grades of black students for years. The district acted fast. Mr. Reynolds was suspended immediately. The weight of his career collapsed in an instant, but the final humiliation was yet to come. The week before Jamal's trip to the White House, the school made one last change. Mr. Reynolds had originally been scheduled to accompany Jamal as his chaperone, a final insult, forcing him to play the role of the proud mentor. But with the scandal unfolding, the district made a last-minute decision. Mr. Reynolds was removed from the trip. His replacement, a black professor from a prestigious university, one who had personally reached out, wanting to support Jamal's journey. The school announced the change publicly, making it clear they were correcting their mistakes, and so the final act of justice was set. On the morning of the trip, Jamal arrived at the school, greeted by a wave of cameras and reporters. His suit was crisp, his confidence unshaken, his future brighter than ever. Students and faculty lined the hallways, cheering for him as he walked toward the waiting car that would take him to the airport. But one person wasn't among them. Mr. Reynolds sat alone in his now empty classroom, staring at the vacant desks, the silence deafening. Through the small window in his door, he could see Jamal laughing with the professor, shaking hands with reporters, flashing that same unstoppable smile. For the first time in his life, Mr. Reynolds wasn't in control. He could do nothing but watch as the student he had tried to destroy left him behind. The White House was buzzing with energy. Cameras flashed, reporters murmured, and a sea of influential figures filled the grand hall, all gathered to witness the moment. At the center of it all stood Jamal Carter, a young black student whose story had captivated the nation. He stood at the podium, his posture strong, his voice steady, as he began his speech. "I was told I wasn't good enough," he said, his words echoing across the room, carried live on national television. "I was held back, underestimated, and denied opportunities, not because of my abilities, but because of the way I look." A hush fell over the crowd, but no one can stop what's meant to be. The room erupted in applause. Jamal continued, speaking about perseverance, justice, and the importance of fighting for what is right. He didn't just speak for himself. He spoke for every student who had been silenced, overlooked, and held back. When he finished, the President of the United States himself stood, shaking Jamal's hand firmly. "Young man, you are the future," he said, looking him in the eye, "and I promise, we will fight for equal education for all." The entire room stood in thunderous applause, some wiping away tears. Jamal had done it. He had turned injustice into a platform for change. Back home, Mr. Reynolds sat alone, watching the speech unfold on his television. His face was blank, his career officially over. The school district had conducted its final review, and the verdict was clear. He was fired permanently. No more power, no more control. Meanwhile, Jamal's future had never been brighter. Scholarship offers flooded in from the nation's top universities, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all wanting the student who had not only proven his intelligence but his resilience. The final shot? Jamal walking across the White House lawn, his shoulders back, his head held high. The sun shone down on him, cameras still rolling, but he wasn't walking for the attention. He was walking toward his future. Because no amount of racism, no unjust system, and no bitter teacher could ever stop his success.